The international political landscape experienced a significant tremor this past week. Former and now current U.S. President Donald Trump made a series of startling comments regarding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and Russian President Vladimir Putin. These remarks, delivered with Trump's characteristic candor, have sent ripples of concern and confusion across allied capitals and, indeed, around the globe. The statements have ignited a fresh wave of debate about America's foreign policy direction under its current leadership. They also raise profound questions about the future of transatlantic unity and the global effort to support Ukraine against Russian aggression. The timing of these comments, May 2025, is particularly sensitive. Diplomatic efforts to broker a lasting peace or at least a more stable ceasefire have been painstakingly slow and fraught with challenges. Ukraine continues to face immense pressure on the battlefield, particularly in the eastern Donbas region. Therefore, any perceived shift in the stance of its most powerful ally, the United States, is bound to have immediate and far-reaching consequences. The world is now closely watching Washington, attempting to discern whether these utterances signal a genuine policy pivot or are merely rhetorical flourishes designed for a domestic audience. The stakes could not be higher for global stability. The most contentious of President Trump's recent statements came during an impromptu press briefing at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. Addressing reporters, Trump offered a perspective on the Ukraine conflict that diverged sharply from established Western narratives. He was quoted as saying, "Frankly, I think Putin's doing what any strong leader would do for his country." This was followed by a critique of NATO's eastward expansion, with Trump adding, "Ukraine never should have been pushed this far by NATO." These particular remarks immediately set off alarm bells in diplomatic circles worldwide, suggesting a potential U.S. sympathy for Russia's security justifications. In recent weeks, Trump has also used his Truth Social platform to call Vladimir Putin absolutely crazy, following a particularly devastating Russian aerial assault on Ukraine. He has also reportedly warned the Russian leader that he was playing with fire, and expressed considerable frustration with the slow pace of ceasefire negotiations. The context of these statements is crucial. They come at a time when the Trump administration is purportedly considering an increase in sanctions against Russia, a move he confirmed he was absolutely weighing. His Ukraine envoy Keith Kellogg has also floated the idea of future peace talks in Geneva, aiming to bring Trump, Putin, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the same table. The lack of a clear, unwavering message is a concern. The reaction from Kyiv to President Trump's Mar-a-Lago comments was swift, unequivocal, and deeply critical. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a leader who has personified his nation's resistance, did not mince words. He publicly condemned Trump's remarks, labeling them a betrayal of democratic values. For a country fighting for its very survival, and heavily reliant on Western, particularly American support, any perceived wavering from its key allies is met with profound alarm. Beyond the presidential condemnation, other Ukrainian officials voiced their concerns and reiterated their demands for continued, robust international backing. Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's influential chief of staff, immediately called for the imposition of more stringent sanctions against Russia. The timing of Trump's comments was particularly galling for Ukraine. The nation is currently grappling with a renewed Russian offensive in the Donbas region and continues to suffer from devastating aerial attacks. Trump's rhetoric has introduced an element of uncertainty that Ukraine can ill afford. The Kremlin's reaction to President Trump's varied statements on Ukraine and Putin has been notably strategic, reflecting a careful calibration designed to exploit any perceived divisions within the West. Following the Mar-a-Lago comments, where Trump appeared to offer some understanding for Putin's motivations, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was quick to offer praise. Peskov characterized Trump's words as a sign of strategic maturity and welcomed what he termed rational voices in Washington. However, the Kremlin has also had to react to Trump's more critical pronouncements. When Trump labeled Putin absolutely crazy on Truth Social after a major Russian assault, Peskov attributed this to emotional overload, a dismissive framing intended to downplay the criticism. Interestingly, despite the sometimes harsh rhetoric from Trump, such as his warning that Putin was playing with fire, the underlying diplomatic channels appear to remain somewhat active. Reports indicate that Trump and Putin recently engaged in a 2-hour phone call to discuss a U.S. proposed ceasefire. Russia's overall response seems designed to keep Washington off balance, encourage Trump's more sympathetic leanings, and test the resolve of the Western alliance. The reverberations from President Trump's comments on Ukraine quickly spread beyond Kyiv and Moscow, prompting reactions from key European allies and other global players. In Germany, a linchpin of European support for Ukraine, Chancellor Annalena Baerbock issued a stark warning. She stated that Trump's rhetoric, particularly the remarks made at Mar-a-Lago, serves to weaken NATO's unified stance against Russian aggression. This sentiment was echoed by other European officials who fear that any perceived fissure in the transatlantic alliance could be exploited by Moscow. France, another crucial European power, responded with notable urgency. Reports indicated that Paris called for an emergency Security Council meeting to discuss the implications of Trump's statements. Further east, Poland, a frontline NATO state with a long history of Russian domination, reacted by placing its troops on a higher state of alert. For Poland and the Baltic states, a strong and unwavering U.S. presence and policy are seen as vital deterrents against potential Russian expansionism. Beyond Europe, other nations are also closely observing the situation. As diplomatic and political discourse swirls, the grim reality on the ground in Ukraine continues into its third year, marked by intense fighting and immense human suffering. Russian forces have recently launched a renewed offensive in the eastern Donbas region, incrementally pushing closer to key urban centers like Kharkiv. This relentless pressure tests Ukrainian defenses, which, despite significant Western military aid, are struggling to maintain momentum against a larger and more heavily armed adversary. The front lines remain volatile, with territory fiercely contested daily, and civilian populations bearing the brunt of the violence. Ukraine's forces are facing sophisticated new challenges. Reports from the battlefield indicate the terrifying effectiveness of new fiber-optic drones being deployed by Russian forces, giving them a distinct advantage in areas around Donetsk. In response, Ukraine is actively working to bolster its domestic weapons production capabilities, a crucial long-term strategy to reduce its reliance on external supplies. Despite the immense challenges, international support continues to flow, though concerns about its sustainability and adequacy persist. Analyzing the motivations behind President Trump's seemingly contradictory statements on Ukraine and Putin requires navigating a complex terrain of domestic politics, personal style, and potential geopolitical strategy. One interpretation suggests that Trump's rhetoric is primarily aimed at his domestic political base. The America First sentiment, which often questions the extent of U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts and alliances, resonates strongly with his supporters. By appearing to challenge established foreign policy norms and even offer a degree of understanding for Putin's perspective, Trump may be reinforcing his image as an outsider willing to disrupt the status quo. Another perspective posits that Trump genuinely believes he can strike a unique deal with Putin to end the war. His envoy, Keith Kellogg, has mentioned ambitions for a summit involving Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, possibly in Geneva. However, critics argue that Trump's approach is dangerously naive and plays into Russia's hands. By publicly questioning NATO's role and appearing to validate some of Russia's grievances, he risks undermining the very alliance structure that has maintained European security for decades. Furthermore, his suggestions that the U.S. might walk away from negotiations if a deal isn't reached quickly could pressure Ukraine into accepting unfavorable terms. This approach has caused considerable alarm among seasoned diplomats and foreign policy experts. The ambiguity stemming from President Trump's recent comments necessitates a careful examination of potential shifts in U.S. policy towards Ukraine and its broader implications for international alliances. While the White House insists that all options are on the table for achieving a negotiated peace, the lack of clarity is unsettling for allies. Diplomats in Ukraine and at NATO headquarters in Brussels are reportedly scrambling to reassure their counterparts that U.S. support remains solid. One potential policy shift could involve a recalibration of U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine. Trump has historically been critical of the extensive aid packages, suggesting European allies should bear more of the burden. While he is currently said to be weighing increased sanctions on Russia, there is also a possibility that future aid to Kyiv could become more conditional. The impact on NATO unity is another critical concern. Trump's past criticisms of the alliance are well documented, and his recent comments blaming NATO expansion for the conflict could further strain transatlantic relations. If the U.S. is perceived as wavering in its commitment to collective defense or as pursuing a unilateral approach to the Ukraine crisis, it could embolden adversaries and encourage fissures within NATO. Internationally, nations will be reassessing their relationship with the United States. President Trump's recent pronouncements on Ukraine and Vladimir Putin have undeniably injected a fresh dose of volatility into an already turbulent global arena. His Mar-a-Lago remarks, suggesting a degree of understanding for Russia's actions and critiquing NATO, have directly challenged the established Western consensus. These statements, juxtaposed with his simultaneous criticisms of Putin and talk of increased sanctions, paint a picture of a U.S. foreign policy that is, at best, complex and, at worst, dangerously contradictory. The immediate future of U.S. support for Ukraine now appears less certain than many had hoped. The reactions from Kyiv, Moscow, and European capitals underscore the profound impact of American rhetoric and policy. Ukraine feels a heightened sense of vulnerability. Russia sees potential openings to exploit, and traditional allies are grappling with unease and the need to reaffirm shared commitments. The conflict itself rages on, with Ukraine fighting valiantly, but facing immense pressure. The critical question now is whether these comments signal a fundamental and lasting shift in U.S. strategy, or represent a temporary, perhaps tactical maneuver by President Trump. Will the United States continue its role as the principal guarantor of support for Ukrainian sovereignty, or will it pursue a more detached, transactional approach that prioritizes a quick, albeit potentially unstable, resolution? The world watches and waits, attempting to decipher the true intentions behind the headlines.